Now that you understand data collection, and you've practiced doing it, I want to use this unit to show you what we do with all the data that we collect, and why. You see, a major goal of ABA interventions is to collect data on students' performances so we can track changes in those performances. And that's how we keep track of a student's progress. We want to know, has the student mastered a skill? Is the student improving on a skill? Is the student making no progress on a skill? Well, to answer these questions, we start with the percent correct a student got for each session on a particular skill. Using the data from many sessions, we create a graph of the student's progress. If the graph of a student's performance shows no improvement, then that student needs more educational support. Now, providing more support could mean using prompts or even a different teaching procedure. So from the ABA perspective, when we see a student who is not making progress, we recognize that the student is not the problem, the teaching is the problem. The tasks and skills that have been thoughtfully developed for students in their individualized education programs require us to find a good match between our teaching and the student's learning needs and strengths. If something is not working, our job as ABA professionals is to figure out what will work. So in this unit, we'll introduce you to how we make and examine graphs of student performances with regard to their progress. As I said earlier, ABA-based interventions like discrete trial training are data-driven. To see a student's progress, we plot data on a line graph. And plotting data simply means transferring the results of teaching sessions onto a graph. Now, before I show you how we do that, I need to make a quick point. How often should you plot data? Put another way, how often should you transfer session results to your line graph? After every 5 sessions? Or 10? After a month of sessions? Well, as with most things you'll end up doing on the job, the answer really depends on the guidance you'll get from your specific supervisor. For me, I transfer data to a master graph after each and every session. That way, it can be viewed at any time to see how a student's progressing. Well, however you end up plotting data, let's talk about how to do it. Now, of course, much of what I'll talk about can be done automatically with a computer spreadsheet program, but I really want you to see the process of graphing. We start with our session data sheets. And of course, you'll have one for each session you conduct with a particular student on a particular skill. Here's Joey's data sheet from his first coin identification session. At the top is the date, and at the bottom is the percent correct. We also have data sheets from the next 9 sessions that Anna conducted with Joey. And we're going to try to plot the data for these 10 sessions. The first thing you would do is arrange the data sheets from the oldest to the most recent. Next, you're going to transfer the date and the total percent correct to a summary sheet. Well, let's take the first data sheet. Copy the date and the percent correct to the first row of the sheet. Then, just continue doing this in chronological order for each of the 9 remaining data sheets that you have. From this summary sheet, we can now create our graph from the earliest session to the most recent one. First, we'll draw the vertical axis and then the horizontal axis. We like to keep the horizontal axis longer than the vertical axis. Now let's add numbers to the vertical axis from 0 to 100, which represents percent correct. Next, we add our dates on the horizontal axis. Notice that we keep the same amount of space between the dates. Next, we add labels to each axis. The vertical axis is labeled total percent correct, and the horizontal axis is labeled session days. Now, the actual plotting of percent correct data is really easy. On the summary sheet, we see that Joey scored 25% correct for his first session. So, draw a dot at the 25% mark above the date for that first session. Then, continue doing the same thing for the remaining 9 sessions. Now, connect the dots with a line, and voila! We have a graph of Joey's first 10 sessions of coin identification. And as you continue to run sessions, you can add to the summary sheet and to your graph. Again, your supervisor will give you guidance for graphing and evaluating your students' progress. If you're not sure, well, just ask. Well, now it's time to review your graph, and that means you'll evaluate the data to determine whether or not the student is making progress. Now, most of the time, you and your supervisor will do this together. Sometimes you just present the graph to your supervisor and he or she will review it. Well, however that ends up working for you, it's still a good idea to know what the data in your graph actually means. Well, let's start with a graph we put together for Joey in the last segment. Take a look. Look at Joey's earliest session. What percent correct did he get? Joey got 25% correct. Now look at the line that connects the other dots. Which way is the line pointing from left to right? Well, the line is pointing diagonally up and to the right. This is what we call an upward trend. Now, what can we say about Joey's performance? We can say, based on this graph of Joey's data, that he is learning. That is, he's showing increasing proficiency in this skill. And with data like this, your supervisor might design programs with new challenges or more demanding tasks for Joey. Okay, let's look at another graph from another student. And I'm going to give you some time to just look at this graph and try to figure out what's going on. So, what do you think? Well, this graph shows us that the student got around the same percent correct across all the sessions plotted on this graph. The line from the first session to the last session is mostly flat, and this means that the student is not making improvements on his performance of the task. If the student was learning, what would be different? Well, if you guessed that we would see an upward trend with higher percent correct data points in the more recent sessions, you'd be right. But this student is not learning and may need some extra assistance to become more independent. Now here's the next graph. What's going on here? Is the student's performance getting worse over time? Well, it is. And we call this decreasing performance a downward trend. Now keep in mind that a single session doesn't give us the whole picture. Instead, we focus on trends, what the graph tells us about many sessions. And this graph is not a picture of a student who just had a bad day or performed poorly in one session. Notice the number of sessions that are represented in this graph. What we're looking at is a consistent pattern of decreasing performance over time. Now, you discuss a graph like this with your supervisor to explore some reasons that the student's performance deteriorated as the sessions went on. For example, are the reinforcers still active? Maybe the student no longer prefers the consequence being provided. Well, this could happen with food items, play items, or even praise. Well, there are lots of possibilities, and a good behavior specialist will help figure out how to solve the problem. Well, let's look at one more graph. Well, what's going on with this one? Well, this is what we call variable performance. Basically, there's no consistent trend. The student isn't making more and more correct responses, but the data isn't flat either. Nor is the student making fewer and fewer correct responses. The student's performance is what we might say all over the place. Well, with data like this, your supervisor will investigate many factors that may be contributing to the student's variable performance. For example, you and your supervisor will probably first reevaluate the student's reinforcers. Then the question becomes what else may be happening around your teaching sessions that might be affecting how the student's doing. For example, are the teaching sessions being run consistently? Is the student getting distracted, or is there something else going on? Well, there's a lot that can be explored. Evaluating progress by reviewing graphs will be an important way to keep up with your students' learning needs. A final point here. The examples I just used all involved percent correct, and we interpreted an upward trend as improvement. But suppose we were graphing data from a behavior we wanted to decrease or eliminate. Well, in that case, a downward trend would be improvement. So just remember what the goal of the intervention is when you evaluate progress. Well, by regularly reviewing a student's progress, we can confidently evaluate whether or not a student is learning a task or skill. A graph of session data, as you've seen in this unit, allows you to see the student's performance across time. You can simply look at the graph and determine whether the student is becoming more and more independent or accurate in his or her performance. If not, we'll know simply by looking at the student's graph. When there's no progress, we know that the student's teaching plan needs to be modified to better assist that student's learning. Well, coming up next, we're going to take a look at how some of the procedures we've learned can be used in what we call the natural environment. So I'll see you there.